All right, so I'd like to start by welcoming everyone to the second day of our conference. And Steve wants me to make sure that I say that we have an action-packed agenda today. And so at the program, our sessions, we're starting off this morning on development for OUD, but then head into cannabis, followed by contingency management. So just a really full day ahead, another great scientific lineup. And but to get us going, our session is going to continue our focus on behavioral pharmacology. And this morning driving in, I was thinking that's kind of ironic because a lot of you are probably bleary-eyed from talking and practicing pharmacology last night. So it kind of is fitting. But in particular, we're going to focus on the history and contributions of behavioral pharmacology to the development of life-saving medications for treating patients with OUD. And I am happy and honored to be introducing really three of the top scientists in this area. So I'll get us going with our first presentation this morning. Speaker is my friend and longtime colleague and Sharon Walsh. Sharon is a professor of behavioral science, and the director of the Center on Drug and Alcohol Research at the University of Kentucky College of Medicine. Research focuses on so many things, but most relevant to today, the development of medications for treatment. And she's played just a key role in advancing buprenorphine as a therapeutic option. And this morning, Sharon is going to talk about just the interesting history and contributions of behavioral pharmacology and of buprenorphine for treatment of OUD. Sharon. Advance and point.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to thank you for showing up so early. Thank you, Stacey and Steve, for inviting me here. Pleasure to be back in Vermont. And for those of you that weren't here yesterday, it was an incredible day. It was really so awesome. And we did marching through history on our topics as well yesterday, which was just a lot of fun and some really wonderful talks. I'm going to talk to you today about the development of buprenorphine for treatment of opioid disorder. And the words that come after this, I probably wrote like 10 different types of things after the colon here. And I just left it with an interesting journey through time because it has been an interesting experience. For my disclosures in the past 3 years, I've served as a scientific advisor for Braeburn, Indivior, Reach, Canoxus, AstraZeneca, and Cerevel Therapeutics, all of whom are working in the OUD space. And then here are my disclaimers for talk. This is a story that's being told from one person's perspective, and I apologize in advance for leaving anyone out, especially my dear French colleague who started it all. But the story unfolds over several decades, and I only have a few minutes. So I'm going to focus on what in the United States. And for me, I have had an opportunity to reflect on the fact that I came into the field early when buprenorphine was being developed as a treatment. I've seen hundreds of potential treatments fall in that same time and saw actually get approved by the FDA, and then saw the experiment of what happens when you roll out a new treatment to the world. It's been kind of amazing to watch life-saving treatment come to the market and to see the dedication of so many scientists across the world contributing to this knowledge base. And it's also been really educational for me to learn about the unexpected controversies that can arise when you deploy a new treatment. So for me, this talk is a little bit unusual because it's not so much about science. I'm usually sharing graphs, but it's a lot of interesting history. And later we'll for the question and answer period, and I'll be happy to answer any questions about science as well. This is the outline for my talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of buprenorphine synthesis, the development of buprenorphine for the treatment of opioid use disorder, the original products, which were Suboxone and the transmucosal generic wars and long-acting products, and now for the contemporary marketplace. So the story starts a really long time ago with called Reckitt Coleman that had been around for a long time, since 1938. Reckitt made household products, including cleaning products and some food products. One of the most famous for is Coleman's mustard in the middle. And I will tell you, if you were part of this development, once buprenorphine was about to launch, and then for years after that, there would always be a dinner at CPDD that people that were doing work would come to and interact and talk about the most contemporary questions. And we would always get a little gift. And this was one of my gifts that I got one year, was a little box of Coleman mustard. So I never opened it. It's, near and dear to my heart. But so then the company took a turn, and Dr. Ken Bentley was given the authority to start an opioid synthesis program back in 1965. He recruited a fellow named John Lewis, who was a chemist, in that same year, and John became the head of the new medicinal chemistry division for the company in 1968. And they were searching for an opioid with fewer side effects and less abuse potential. And as you all know, this is the holy grail that we have all been searching for through the years with the mixed agonist, antagonist, the biased agonist, it goes on and on. And we're still searching for that holy grail. This is a picture of John. And I just want to say that I had the privilege of knowing John. He was a really fine gentleman. And he passed away just this past month in September. So 1 year after they start this chemistry program, they developed buprenorphine in just a single year. So in 1966, they had already identified buprenorphine, and it was a semi-synthetic opioid that was derived from either thebaine or iprabrine, as the scaffold, which are alkaloids from the poppy plant. And John worked really closely with a gentleman named Alan Cohen, who subsequently went to Temple University, and they decided to pursue buprenorphine as an analgesic. At that time, buprenorphine was characterized as a mixed agonist-antagonist, and we don't usually say this so much anymore, but there's a lot of great work that was done in this period, and it was coined when less was known about the structure and function of all the receptors and the subtypes. But the scientists were very clever, and they recognized that there were these differential and multiple actions, and they were really pretty spot on given the amount of knowledge that they had at the time about the receptors. Now what we know about buprenorphine, of course, is that it's a partial mu opioid agonist, which means that it has an improved safety profile compared to a full mu agonist. It's also a kappa antagonist. And there's been a lot of interest in trying to develop buprenorphine for other indications where a kappa antagonist may be indicated. It also has actions at the ORL or 1 nociceptin receptor, and it has a really long duration of action. So this is a picture of Alan Cohen, the pharmacologist that did all the original work, and you can see this paper where he describes buprenorphine as an agonist, antagonist, and is proposing it as a new anti-nociceptive agent. So it took about 10 years, and the company had a lot of ambivalence. And I want to say that Chris Chaplio, who worked for Reckitt for a really long time, was very instrumental in developing buprenorphine as it was coming to the marketplace. I was able to talk with him and get some information about his perspective of what the company was thinking at the time. So they developed this as an analgesic, mostly as injectables, both in the UK and in the United States. And you can see the years there. So 1978, 1981. So now we're, 10, 15 years away from when the molecule was first discovered. And then Temgesic tablets came onto the market as well. So buprenorphine has really poor oral bioavailability. So this was always a challenge in the drug development as well. So meanwhile, back on the farm, and if you don't know what I'm talking about the Lexington prison, the public health hospital. And this is a picture of Don Jasinski. I also was really lucky when I landed at BPRU so many years ago. Don was at Hopkins by then. He had been at the ARC for a long time. He had worked at the Lexington prison farm. He was an amazing and very, very kind person. He took me under his wing. He worked really closely with Kenzie Preston for all the years that he was at Hopkins. But this is before all that happens. This is when the public health system has the prison farm operating in Lexington, where there's a group of scientists who've been there since the program was there since the 30s, where they were able to do experiments with prisoners who mostly had substance use histories and really begin to learn some of the fundamentals around what was physical dependence, what did withdrawal look like, and not just for opioids. They studied all classes of agents. And ultimately, the prison farm, they have to shut down that program, and a lot of people moved to Baltimore, and that became the NIDA Intramural Research Program. So Dunn published a paper in 1978 on buprenorphine, which I think was really kind of the first full characterization of buprenorphine in humans, as opposed to Allen's work that had been done in rats. And what I've come to learn is that buprenorphine they would sequentially go through drugs as they got access to them to try to characterize them. And they were very important in characterizing, like butorphanol and pentazocine and all these drugs, some of which, you won't have heard of. But it was reported that buprenorphine was actually the very last drug that they studied before they got shut down. And so, what happened with the shutdown was that the Tuskegee Institute study had been revealed. People were up in arms about how human subjects research was happening. And they decided at that time, no more research on prisoners. They don't have any autonomy. We really need to reevaluate how we do human subjects research. And of course, it was forever changed after that. And I think, for the better, although that's not to say that they didn't have protections in place for this type of work at the time. So this is the paper that Dunn published. And if you have not ever gone back to any of the papers that have come out of that period of time, I really strongly encourage you to go look, and especially if it overlaps with your area, because the quality of the science is amazing. And the insights that people had that were working in the field, it's really very striking when you go back. I mean, their studies in some way are much more rich than the studies that we do now. But a lot of it is lost because some of the science was reported in public health reports that weren't really published or cataloged. A lot of them were in early NIDA monographs, and some of them made it to the peer-reviewed literature like this one. So Dunn did, in a single paper, he described single-dose studies. He described direct addiction studies, which is like to give somebody the drug repeatedly and see whether or not they are going to become physically dependent and what that would look like and what the withdrawal would look like. And he also did morphine blockade studies to see whether or not buprenorphine could block the effects of morphine that was given on top of it. And the things that he concluded were that buprenorphine was far more potent than morphine, but was a partial agonist. And of course, he was spot on, that it had a really long duration of action, that it had limited physical dependence. Now, that was compared to full agonists. We know that it has physical dependence, and that it wasn't reversible by naloxone, and that it produced what he called morphine blockade. And he defined this as both cross-tolerance and competitive antagonism, which is really fun because I think that sometimes when we talk about blockade, we still have to go back to that definition to help people understand that it's not pure antagonism. And then he concluded correctly that this was a potential treatment for narcotic addiction. And despite this, it was not approved in the United States for another 25 years. So this is not something that moves at a rapid pace. So slowly after that paper comes out, we start making progress in the United States. And in 1989, Congress mandated the development of the NIDA Medications Development Division, which was then called MDD and is now DTMC. And we would have heard from Herman yesterday if the government shutdown weren't happening and he was able to attend. He's from that division, which still exists. And they mandated this because they recognized the need for treatments, but they also recognized that pharmaceutical industries really were not that interested in helping to develop treatments for substance use disorders because they didn't think that it would, one, pay off, and also because they're stigmatized. And so if you hear Nora talk about this, she'll say that, NIDA really does take on, or has historically taken on, the responsibility for most of the medications development work and funding compared to the private sector. In 1990, Dr. Bob Schuster convened a technical review of NIDA grantees that were working on buprenorphine already to try to bring the best people together in the room and figure out how to proceed. And in 1993, there was a CRADA that was developed and posted by NIDA. So this is a cooperative research and development agreement, which brings 2 or 3 parties together with a very specific goal in mind. And the goal was to develop buprenorphine and to get it to the point of an NDA, to get it approved. It was a very hard sell at Reckitt. You can see lots of time has passed. They've moved on to other things. I really think that if it wasn't for Dr. Chris Chaplio, who put his own job on the line several times, we probably wouldn't have buprenorphine as a treatment for OUD. And I think, when you think that that was the last drug that Don Jasinski was able to study there, it's possible that, if the Tuskegee stuff had happened a little earlier, it would have also thwarted this development. So I asked Chris, was this, what was the thinking around the time? Because it was before my time, and I certainly wasn't part of the company. And whether this was an appealing opportunity. The U.S. government is saying, we'll partner with you, we'll give you money, they're really going to try to facilitate it. And these are the things that Chris said about it. It was unattractive and highly stigmatized therapeutic area. It was a very difficult therapeutic area politically. Patients were seen as undeserving of treatment, and it was seen as a social rather than a medical problem. Methadone was already in use as a cheap generic. So, where was the space going to be for this? There was no intellectual property associated with buprenorphine. In the US at the time, treatment was confined to methadone clinics, or what we call opioid treatment programs now, that limited the potential opportunity for treating patients. Reckitt had no global pharmaceutical infrastructure. They were a relatively, small UK, at this point, partnership company. And resources were very limited, both personnel and finances. But after much cajoling, Reckitt decided to move forward. So the cooperative agreement was put into place, as I said, with the goal to develop sublingual buprenorphine, both in combination with naloxone as an abuse deterrent and as a product of buprenorphine alone for the treatment of opioid dependence. And the CRADA was between NIDA, Reckitt Benckiser, and the VA cooperative system, which were partnering. And the VA cooperative system was going to do these pivotal studies that were needed to get the approval. So now this was an article that was published in the Times in 2013. And it is a really interesting article. I would recommend reading if you're interested at all. But this journalist is looking back on how this all came about and says the treatment, meaning buprenorphine, is the fruit of an extraordinary public-private partnership between a British company and the American government, which financed clinical trials and awarded protection from competition after the drug's patent expired. So, I said there was no intellectual property value to it. So that was one of the things that they agreed to, was that they would have a longer period of exclusivity to make it to encourage the company to be interested. The Federal Drug Abuse Institute financed the 2 big clinical trials necessary to win FDA approval for $28 million, and later spent an additional $52.4 million for studies at its clinical research sites. So this is where my little part of the story comes in, because I happened to enter at a time before buprenorphine has been developed. The technical review happens the first year that I'm a postdoc at BPRU. And there I'm working with George Bigelow and Maxine Stitzer, who's here in the audience. And so I'm calling this the halcyon days of buprenorphine because it was a pretty remarkable time, and kind of limiting it to the late 1980s and 1900s. So as I said, the work was largely supervised by George and Max. And of course, they had T32 programs that had been running for a long time, lots of people coming through. They had very generous NIDA grants at the time. I remember they had both a P50 and what was called a treatment research unit grant, which was like a P50. I don't even think that exists anymore. But these are some of the people that came through the program and contributed to this early work, and of course went on to make lots of great contributions, including Warren Bickel, Kenzie Preston, Eric Strain, myself, Ed Johnson, who's got some asterisks after his name because Ed had been working at the ARC at NIDA and had already been doing studies on buprenorphine, was the pharmacist pouring methadone in the morning at BPRU as a second job, which is how I got to know him. Ultimately left the government, retired, came to BPRU. He and I and others worked together for many years. And then the year that I left to go to Kentucky, he left and went to work for Indivior, which was the US spinoff of Reckitt. So Ed had a role before, in the middle, and at the end as well. Harry June, Mark Greenwald, Tom Eisenberg, Andre Jones, Stacey Sigmon, Lisa Marsh. And there was a tremendous amount of work that was going on at the same time, really great work, especially some of the preclinical work that was underway with Nancy Mello, Jack Mendelson, Gail Winger, Jim Woods, Charles, who's in the audience, Marilyn Carroll, Sandy, of course, Paul Fadala, and John Mendelson. This is just 3 generations that are on that slide. I was forced to include this. This is actually from here in Vermont 2 nights ago at dinner. We were having a lot of fun reminiscing though. So I'm not going to go through like the studies that were done at that time. There were so many studies that were underway. And trying to generally think about if this drug were to get to market, what would physicians need to know about how to use it and how to get people onto it? We're still struggling with some of those questions now in the era of fentanyl, so that's also really interesting. But the kinds of questions was, that we were asking, how does it compare to methadone? How do you induct somebody onto it when they're already, have physical dependence? What doses should be used for induction? What doses are effective for maintenance? What are the conditions under which precipitated withdrawal occurs? How can you get people from methadone onto buprenorphine? Is it safe in combination with other drugs? What are the differences between the buprenorphine alone product and buprenorphine with naloxone? So we take a lot of these things for granted, but a lot of these things had to be evaluated in those early studies. So then the next question came, let's say the data were looking pretty good for the pivotal studies, that it was effective, had efficacy and safety. So how do you get it onto the market? Well, it wasn't really appealing, I don't think, to anyone to confine buprenorphine delivery to the OTP system because it's so restrictive and there's a fixed number of slots. And honestly, it hasn't grown that much over all the years that it's been in place. And we have this pesky Harrison's Narcotic Act of 1914 that was still in place, still is in place, that prevented doctors from prescribing what was called narcotics, which in this case was opioids, to treat people for their opioid use disorder. And the OTP system was really an exception to that. So a champion was needed to help change the law, and along came Charles O'Keefe. And I think many of you in this room know Charles. He's very wise. He had worked in very different parts of the industry over the years. He had supervised the urine testing program for the Vietnam vets during the war. He served the White House under 3 different presidents. And Charles had some ideas about what maybe could be done to improve the likelihood that buprenorphine would get to patients that needed it. And with his help and bipartisan support to pass enabling, they were able to pass the Drug Addiction Treatment Act of 2000 that enabled prescribing out of a physician's office rather than just out of the OTP. And the law provides for treatment of opiate use disorder with a Schedule 3, 4, or 5 opioid medication that are approved and indicated for OUD by the FDA. To date, buprenorphine is the only one of those, but if there were others that came along, they would fit into this as well. It came with a lot of restrictions because people were very concerned about abuse potential, and those restrictions included a special license, specific training requirements for physicians, patient limits, and provision, the ability to provide or refer to counseling. And they also, buprenorphine at the time was a Schedule 5 opioid, and they increased that restriction to Schedule 3 at the time that this was approved. Over the years now, and during the pandemic, a lot of the rules have changed, and I'm not going to go through all of that, but they've loosened in a lot of ways around patient limits. We can do telehealth, things like that, that were previously prohibited. So buprenorphine was finally approved by the FDA in October of 2002, 25 years after Jasinski published his seminal paper. Both products were approved. They are approved under orphan drug status, which generally means that less than 200,000 people will use it. This is before the prescription opioid epidemic took hold in this country. I don't think anybody could have imagined what the market size would be at that point. And they were given extended exclusivity, and they launched on the market Subutex, which was mainly for women that were pregnant, and Suboxone that contained naloxone. And buprenorphine ends up becoming a blockbuster. I don't think anybody really anticipated this. And the good side of this was that other companies saw that they actually might be able to have a winner in the addiction space. And there was a lot of growing interest that came out of this. And then Indivior, throughout this period, becomes independent from Reckitt Benckiser as the U.S. division. But along with that, there become pill mills that are disguised as buprenorphine clinics start to flourish in the U.S. And the U.S. starts, as the U.S. is cracking down on opioid prescribing. We had a lot of problems with this in Kentucky. Physicians had legitimate practices, were under a lot of scrutiny by the DEA. There was, diversion and misuse. My colleague Michelle Lawful and I published this paper with some international colleagues. And then I think, the drug was doing well, and the opioid crisis was increasing, and the exclusivity of the drug was ending, which meant that generics were going to come onto the market. At that time, Indivior went to the FDA, and they stated that the tablet was a pediatric overdose safety risk, and they wanted to pull it from the market and introduce a safer film. And they did introduce the film, and that's what we have now. But by pulling it from the market for safety reasons, it would have precluded some generic companies from moving forward with competitor products. Well, the FDA didn't agree with them that it was a safety problem, and they approved the generic tablets anyway. But at the same time, they also reported the company to the Federal Trade Commission for potentially anti-competitive practices. And what followed was a raid of the company headquarters, and several years long investigation that didn't end well. So Indivior pled guilty and paid lots of money. I think then their CEO ended up spending some time in jail, and then Reckitt still was on the hook also. So I think that the total settlement was something like $2 billion in both civil and criminal charges related to this. The current status of the formulations is, throughout these years since, there's been numerous generic formulations that differ in subtle ways, I think, that have come onto the market, including oral products, and some of those have already come off of the marketplace, and long-acting formulations, including injectables and one implant, which came off the market as very soon after it came on the market, mostly due to sales. And these are the long-acting products that are kind of getting some legs now. And the implant was a 6-month implant. It was a low dose of buprenorphine, and they just were not selling. So they've removed that. And then there's a monthly injectable that is called Sublocade, and there are weekly and monthly injectables that are Brixadi in the US. So my conclusions are that buprenorphine and methadone are widely accepted as the gold standard for treatment of opiate use disorder. Both are life-saving. Studies show that people that are on those medications are, 50% more likely to survive than the people that are not on medications, but still are plagued by stigma, despite the fact that we're so many years into this. Buprenorphine is the most widely used opiate use disorder treatment in the US, accounting for about 60% of those treated with medications. However, we know that from other studies, only about 25% of individuals who are in need of treatment receive medication, and that our current treatments are not perfect, so there's still a lot of room for improvement. The current controversies around buprenorphine include challenges with induction in the era of fentanyl, and therapeutic dose ranges for those people that are physically dependent on fentanyl. There are other nice resources for anybody who's interested. I'm happy to share this. Nancy Campbell, a historian, wrote this wonderful book called The Narcotic Farm, which is a great history. And there's an accompanying PBS video that goes along with it. The figure to the far side, that's actually from a review that Christian Heidbreder and colleagues wrote. He's, I believe, still the CEO of the company. So he wrote the history of it from the company perspective. And then just very recently, there was a really interesting article in the New York Times by Shoshana Walter that provides some interesting overview and kind of context for this. So with that, I thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. That was great. We're going to hold off on questions for all three presenters until the end, and then we'll have like 15 or so minute Q&A period at the end of the session. And also should note so jot down your questions for those that are with us in person, but then anyone online, you can send them in, Chris? Okay. All right, so we're going to keep things moving. Our next speaker this morning is Kelly Dunn. And Kelly is actually an alumna of our predoctoral T32 training program here at UVM and was actually my first grad student. So essentially, we can really think about all the good work she has done up to this point and in the future as because of me. Kelly is now the founding director of the Kahlert Institute of Addiction Medicine, and that's at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. She uses a range of behavioral pharmacology tools to develop strategies to improve treatment outcomes for individuals with OUD, among many other topics. And this morning, she will be speaking to us about the application of behavioral pharmacology to understanding and addressing opioid withdrawal. Kelly. Can you advance here and there? Okay.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the opportunity to come and talk today. So the focus of my talk, I wanted to talk about maybe a new emerging area of work that I'm hopeful that we can continue to build. And it's kind of an homage to the work that Warren Bickel did in behavioral pharmacology, and then also that John Hughes and Dorothy Hatsukami have pioneered with regard to measuring withdrawal as a treatment target for a substance use disorder. So I want to talk about behavioral pharmacology to inform the opioid withdrawal syndrome. So the outline of this talk is I'm hoping to convince you that we still have a lot to learn about the opioid withdrawal syndrome and that there's meaningful variability in how it's expressed across individuals, both with regard to the severity of it and the incidence of it, and that human behavioral pharmacology is an optimal strategy to explore these variations and to inform new treatment directions. So if you've worked with people who have opioid use disorder, you're probably familiar with the fact that they often come to treatment because they have trouble managing their opioid withdrawal syndrome. It's a severe syndrome. This is how we generally depict it. Often people will come in and say, I don't want to use opioids anymore, but I just can't go through this withdrawal. And so the management of withdrawal is one of the primary features that we aim to achieve in treatment for opioid use. And that's something that methadone and buprenorphine are very useful and very effective at doing. So this is kind of the general schematic of opioid withdrawal. We have this acute syndrome. It varies in duration depending on if the person is using a short-acting or a long-acting opioid, but generally we see this kind of peak up here after several days and then a decline in the acute severity. And then we have what's recognized as a protracted syndrome that might last for up to 30 days or perhaps longer. I think we have a lot to learn about the protracted syndrome still. The syndrome itself is often described as a severe case of the flu. But if you've worked with people who have opioid use, I think you'd agree with me that it must be something much more severe than that, because it's something that it just really drives continued use of opioids despite negative consequences. And it's described often as muscle aches and pains and joint aches and nausea, diarrhea, yawning. It can progress into vomiting, hot and cold flashes, goosebumps, pupil dilation, runny eyes, runny nose, and then it also includes things like craving, severe sleep impairment or insomnia, where people often can't sleep for several days, and then mood disruption and anxiety. So this is kind of the general syndrome. And again, I think when you talk to people who work in this area, we all kind of understand what the syndrome is. But the case I'm hoping to make for you is that we still have more to learn about how to operationalize this syndrome. So there was a scoping review that was done a few years ago that identified 18 different measures on which you could, different skills on which you can measure opioid withdrawal. Many of these scales have been, they are widely variable. So they are observed ratings, they're self-report ratings, they're combinations. Sometimes they rate things on a scale of 0 to 10. Sometimes it's just presence or absence. There's no consistency in how these different scales are rating them. If you look at, we actually took all of the scales and tried to see what are the symptoms that are represented across all of the scales. And what we could find is that there are these 19 symptoms here that were represented by at least 4 scales, but no one scale had all of those 19 symptoms. And so I think the case that I would like to make is that we don't have in our field, I think, a strong consensus about what opioid withdrawal is, because the type of withdrawal that you might experience or the severity that you would be rated on is going to be it's somewhat dependent upon the scale on which it's measured. And the reason that this is problematic is that many of our treatments for opioid withdrawal, for the acute withdrawal syndrome, are these symptomatic medications. So if you have muscle aches and pains, we give you ibuprofen, or if you have anxiety, we might give you a medication for that. But what we're finding is that if the likelihood, or I guess the severity or the incidence of that depends on the scale on which it's measured. We also don't have a strong understanding, or I guess maybe a consensus in the field regarding the manner in which we measure this. And so we have self-reported scales and we have observer rating scales. And I think the field traditionally has really erred on the side of observed ratings of withdrawal. But the case I'd like to make is that the self-reported symptoms, I think, are they're perhaps more impactful. And so this is a study where this is a secondary data analysis of people that were in a withdrawal program for 11 days, and they had withdrawal ratings measured 7 times a day. So very sensitive, very granular assessment of withdrawal. And we looked at across all of those individuals, and they were treated overall, and then some of them were treated with clonidine, buprenorphine, or tramadol, which are different forms that could have different effects on the withdrawal syndrome. And we just looked at what's the time at which the symptom first emerged for these individuals. And across the board, what we saw in the black circles here are self-reported withdrawal, and the red square are observer ratings of withdrawal. What we saw is that across the board, the self-reported symptoms generally emerged first, often hours before the observer could visualize the symptom, which meant that the individual was telling us that they were experiencing something well before we could see it. So we had many hours of time to intervene on that symptom before it became severe enough that it was actually observable. And in some cases, there's very wide variation here where they reported, anxiousness several hours before they were actually observed as being anxious. And so again, I think that we just have, there's a lot of convention in the field regarding how we measure this, but there's not a lot of standardization or kind of deep diving into the literature or into the data to see exactly how we might improve our ability to do this. In addition, patients don't generally endorse all symptoms. So if you've worked with people who are going through withdrawal, what we find is that what we actually do now, what I do now is I go in and ask people, what are the symptoms that you generally experience? And then we try to constrain their withdrawal rating to those symptoms, because when we have a scale that measures something, so if you have the subjective opioid withdrawal scale, which is one of the most commonly used self-reported scales, it has a high rating of 64 that people can achieve, and it has benchmarks. So if you have 0 to 9, then you have mild withdrawal and so on. What we find is that many of our participants will tell us, well, I've never experienced, 7 of these items. And so that means that their upper rating of 64 is an unfair rating, right? It's an unfair benchmark for them because as far as they are concerned, they will never achieve that. And so if we titrate their medication or we consider their severity on the basis of this kind of upper limit of the scale, then we are probably misrepresenting the severity of their experience. And so what this shows you here, again, this is from the same data set that I talked about earlier. So we looked across for 11 days, so 77 potential ratings for people, and asked and looked to see what symptoms were ever experienced. So when they went through this full withdrawal syndrome, they told us that their withdrawal had resolved. What symptoms did these individuals experience? And if you look at, this is self-report and this is observed ratings, and you can see things like lacrimation, which is runny nose, and yawning, restlessness, cold flashes were experienced by the majority of people, but we had things like vomiting that were experienced by a minority. So 37% of people that reported feeling like they were going to vomit. But if you look at observer ratings, you see resting changes in pulse rate, pupil size, lacrimation, and sweating were very high. But again, goose flesh was very low. And the reason that this is important is that some things like goose flesh and vomiting are in these scales that weight the symptoms. They are the highest weighted symptoms. And so somebody, if they don't have goose flesh, may be observed as not having, or maybe the assumption may be that they don't have severe withdrawal, but for that individual, they never, these individuals, very, 1 in 5 never, or 4 out of 5 never experience that. And this is just depicted for you here just to show you, these are the individual symptoms and individual participants, and you could just see that there's incredible variability in the way that they are experiencing withdrawal and manifesting withdrawal. And then we also have, when we've done studies to ask people, do you have what symptoms have you ever experienced? We find that there's a very large number of symptoms that people say they've never experienced. And so this was a study conducted online with people, 124 individuals who endorsed having a lifetime history of opioid withdrawal. We listed out a very large number of symptoms, things that we actually took from other withdrawal syndromes like alcohol and tobacco, and other symptoms that we invented just as kind of positive controls. And we asked them to indicate which of these have you ever experienced in relation to opioid withdrawal. And then if you have experienced them, would you say that is it common or is it rare, or have you, again, have you never? And you can see in the dark here in the black, these are the symptoms that were rated by people, or the percentage of respondents who said that they never experienced these symptoms. And then these are the, across the top, these are the common experiences of symptoms. And so again, you could just see that there's wide variability here. And then when we did a cluster analysis, we found that they actually clustered into 2 groups, which we named the high and low endorsers. So and we don't know what this means, right? It could mean that these are individuals who have been using opioids for a very long period of time and their severity of dependence is deeper and it invokes different physiological experiences. I don't know, but I think that it's important that we understand that this variability exists because it gives us opportunity to probe this using some empirical designs and to understand more about it. Because I think in my mind, this variability is where we could identify new therapeutic targets, right? If we can really understand what is the mechanisms underlying the expression of these different symptoms. And just another piece of evidence that this is important. So this is a study, this is a secondary analysis of a study that was run by Dr. Eric Strain, Cecilia Bergaria, and Anjali Sharma. They were enrolling people who were at this point now fentanyl exposed in the Baltimore area. So in Baltimore, we've had exclusive fentanyl exposure since 2019. So people no longer test positive for non-fentanyl opioids. And so they replicated that study I was talking about before, where they had people everyone was stabilized on morphine for a 7-day period, and we had frequent measures of withdrawal. But in this case, we had this nice opportunity to do this quasi-experimental design where some of those individuals, we were able to take individuals that were exclusively fentanyl exposed and compare their withdrawal ratings to individuals prior to that who had been exposed to heroin. And we knew that through urinalysis testing. And so this is the design. Again, people came in, they were stabilized on morphine for 7 days. And then we were able to look at their withdrawal just during that period. Just to show you, this is kind of a control comparison. So this is a large sample. This is a smaller sample on the individuals who are fentanyl exposed. But the groups were really remarkably similar otherwise. So they were the same age, they had the same educational background, same racial distribution, slightly more individuals of Hispanic ethnicity in the fentanyl exposed group, and the same distribution of gender. So all things match. They have the same stabilization period. They're relatively similar people. The main difference is that these individuals, the latter individuals, were fentanyl exposed. And so here's the data on this. So you can see here, this is the morphine dosing day across the bottom. This is their stabilization on morphine before they were actually submitted into an interventional design. And this is their peak withdrawal severity. This is self-reported, and this is observed withdrawal severity. The historical control group, you could see when they came in and they were heroin exposed and we administered morphine, they had it nicely managed their withdrawal syndrome for them. The individuals who were fentanyl exposed, you can see, had a very different experience. And we have hypotheses as to why this increases like it does, but you could see that the morphine was no longer sufficient to help maintain these individuals. So they had a dramatically different experience. And that was evident in self-reported withdrawal as well as clinical observed withdrawal. If you worked with people who are withdrawing off of opioids and you understand the scale, so this is a subjective opioid withdrawal scale, again, a higher limit, the upper limit is 64. Individuals who are in the 20s are really suffering. So this is a very severe experience. It's very difficult, I should say, for them to experience this level of withdrawal. And to have that happen in the context of very high doses of morphine administered several times daily was really surprising and shocking to us. Another way to look at this is to take their withdrawal and actually bin it based on mild, moderate, or severe using these kind of standard categories and look at it across days. And so this is the individuals, again, this is the fentanyl exposed individuals and the heroin exposed historical control. And these are the same dosing days across the bottom, the morphine dosing days. And you can see the red are the number of or the number of individuals who withdrawal crossed into that severe threshold at some point during that day. And you can see that, again, it's just a much more severe experience for those individuals. So I think so this, demonstrates that there's a lot of factors that are contributing to the opioid withdrawal syndrome. And that in the context of fentanyl in particular, we have a lot of need to really probe this and understand what's going on so that we can identify new potential treatments for these individuals, ways that we can layer on and improve beyond the medications that we have. And so behavioral pharmacology comes into this. So I'll describe some data, but just to set up the study, the data I'm about to show you are a secondary analysis from this larger design. And so this is the data that I just showed you, kind of the design I just showed you, where we invite people who have opioid use disorder into our residential treatment program. They're stabilized onto an opioid. In this case, it was morphine for 7 days to kind of equilibrate their acute physical dependence. So everyone's about the same level. And then they receive a dose of naloxone, which is the opioid antagonist. It's a small dose. It produces an acute withdrawal syndrome. And we measure withdrawal. We rate it several times throughout that naloxone challenge period. At the end of 2 hours, usually the withdrawal has remitted, but regardless, everyone receives an opioid agonist at the end. So the rationale for this is that it helps to really nicely identify the physical dependence experience of the person. And then that is used as a stratification variable to randomly assign them into one of these different interventional control groups. And in this case, they were randomly assigned to receive clonidine, which is a non-opioid medication that works on the autonomic nervous system, tramadol, which is an opioid-like medication, and then buprenorphine, which you just learned about in the last talk. And in this, they were in a double-blinded taper for 7 days, and then they had a double-blinded placebo period where they crossed over they crossed over into placebo. So we had this nice opportunity to look at the effects of these medications from people following this kind of acute naloxone challenge. And so then what I wanted to do for this, again, given this experience that we've had that demonstrates that withdrawal is just highly variable across people, we took the data from that naloxone challenge and calculated the area under the curve and then did a cluster analysis on it to see, like, are there different groups of people here? And what we concluded was that there were 2 clusters, which we have termed the high and low withdrawal phenotype. So this is the 120 minutes of the naloxone challenge, and this is their mean self-reported withdrawal score across the y-axis. And then you can see this is the low phenotype group in the filled circles, where their highest withdrawal was about a 15. And then this is the high phenotype group here. So they had a much more severe experience of withdrawal. And so then we took this categorization and we separated and we applied it as a between groups variable to other measures during this period. And this is kind of the behavioral pharmacology of this. And we saw that the group delineation really was maintained. So the individuals who had high self-reported withdrawal also had larger pupil diameters, indicative of more physiological response. They also had higher observer ratings of withdrawal, and they also had greater feelings of liking or feel like using. opioids during that session, and it applied across the board. Every variable that we looked at, it really was a nice categorization and delineated between those two. So then we wanted to see, so this tells us, right, maybe there really are these two different groups of individuals. That's kind of what we observe, but it's nice to see it come out in the data. And then we wondered what that actually meant for the medications that they were randomized to. So we looked, this is the low phenotype group here. Across the bottom, this is the morphine stabilization period again. This is their double-blind taper period, the 7-day taper period, and then this is their double-blind post-taper period. In the open circles, that's individuals who were randomly assigned to clonidine, the triangles are tramadol, and then the blue squares are buprenorphine. If these individuals during the naloxone challenge showed that they were a low withdrawal phenotype, it really did not matter with regard to their self-reported withdrawal what medication they were randomly assigned to. And which is, I think, remarkable to think that somebody who received buprenorphine had the same experience as somebody who received clonidine, which is a very different type of medication. And then we saw the same kind of relationship with pupil as well. So buprenorphine, we saw no real differentiator between individuals during, if they were low withdrawal phenotype during the naloxone challenge. However, the individuals who are the high withdrawal phenotype, we saw a big differentiation here. So in these individuals, if they were randomly assigned to clonidine, they had much more severe withdrawal during that period than if they were randomly assigned to buprenorphine or tramadol. And an interesting phenomenon that we've observed for a long time is that there's a discontinuation effect of buprenorphine. So usually after people finish buprenorphine in a rapid taper, they will have the next 2 days, in the 2 days afterwards, they have a rebound of withdrawal severity, which we've often assumed is a discontinuation. And that rebound is very customary to see in these trials, and you can see it really nicely here. And you actually see a little bit of a bump with tramadol as well, and it was completely eliminated in the low withdrawal phenotype. And then if you look at pupil, you again see major differentiation, where in these individuals, buprenorphine was really important, and you had much more severe pupil dilation in individuals who received either tramadol or clonidine. So it seems like this low withdrawal and high withdrawal phenotype is meaningful, right? That it actually predicted in this acute withdrawal setting, it predicted the experience that they had, or was associated, I should say, with the experience that they had in the subsequent trial. And then we also looked at retention in the low withdrawal phenotype. There was very good retention overall, and 100% retention if they were assigned to buprenorphine, which, if you have worked again in this field, I've never seen a 100% retention rate in people that are being withdrawn. So that was incredible to see. And then in the high withdrawal phenotype, you see this kind of drug-dependent change. So I think, using behavioral pharmacology, we can really start to pull apart the variability in these populations, and it helps us to understand. And when we talk about buprenorphine, it's often, there's a lot of concerns about being able to get buprenorphine out. And I think it's easier now than it was several years ago. But for a long time, we talked a lot about just try to make it as widely available as possible. We want providers to prescribe more. And I've often thought that in this case, this might be a way for us to help triage, right? So if we knew that we had limited buprenorphine slots, and we could identify those individuals who absolutely needed to have buprenorphine versus those individuals that would do okay with clonidine, then we could start to do a more precision medicine-based treatment matching for individuals, and maybe in that way help expand our access to buprenorphine. I'd like to take this a step further and actually look at factors in different domains of withdrawal. I think after working in this field for a long time, I personally believe that there are sub-syndromes of withdrawal, that some people have a more GI-centric withdrawal and some people have a more autonomic withdrawal. And that's my kind of speculation, but I'm hoping to really follow that up in some of these behavioral pharmacology trials. But I think if we could do that it would help inform therapeutic targets, and it would help us also understand the underlying physiology that's different about people and why they're responding to these differently. And so we took those same data and did a factor analysis and found 4 factors here, where we looked in where they kind of grouped together. So we had more physiological, autonomic factors here. We had more more GI factors here. And then you can see again across the days the number of individuals who met the ratings or the percent of their withdrawal syndrome that was occupied by these different factors kind of changes over time. So withdrawal, it's very difficult to measure because there's a lot of confounding features. People tend to leave the withdrawal early. You have to give symptomatic medications because you can't just withdraw somebody and not treat their symptoms, and those factor into the ratings of withdrawal, right? So it's hard. But I think that we could, by doing it in these kind of controlled settings, it will be more successful in really being able to pinpoint this. And just one more example of this is we have been kind of probing the dopaminergic system as a target for withdrawal for a bit. And these are data from Cecilia Bergaria, also a UVM alumni, who she embedded a randomized trial into a treatment program, a real world clinical treatment program, where she did a double-blind evaluation of buspirone, which is a D3 antagonist, among other things. It's an anxiety medication, but we used it for its D3 activities versus placebo, and looked to see whether or not it changed the withdrawal syndrome for people. And I just want to set up that this was a very difficult, kind of messy trial because it's real world. The patients were getting different types of treatments from their providers. They were getting different symptomatic medications. And so it was really set up to not find an effect, especially with a small sample. And yet she saw this major decrease in withdrawal severity in individuals who had buspirone relative to placebo. And that if you looked at individual symptoms that you might predict are specifically dopaminergically mediated, things like perspiring or restlessness or yawning, that's where we saw the signal. So I think, again, we can probe this. We know that there's variability. We can probe this using these designs and these kind of small subject studies to be able to understand more therapeutic targets. And so that's what we're doing at the moment. We're actually trying to prospectively look at variability in withdrawal. So we're bringing in individuals who have opioid use disorder. We're stabilizing them for 5 days on hydromorphone, and giving them 2 naloxone challenges, one that's pretreated with placebo, another with lofexidine, which is a medication that's like clonidine. And then we're tapering them all in an open label way with lofexidine. We want the variability, and we're collecting every biosample and every measure that we can to try to be able to, at the end, say, here's an array of 5 questions that you might be able to ask that would help you understand if this person will respond to lofexidine, or what physiological biomarkers might show us a signal to help us kind of explore this further. And so I'll conclude just to say that hopefully I've convinced you that the opioid withdrawal syndrome is not well operationalized and we need more work in this area, and that there's substantial variability in the expression of symptoms, both in severity and incidence across individuals. The treatment of opioid use disorder and withdrawal often involves layering of symptomatic medications. And I think that there's now an FDA indication for opioid withdrawal. So we have the potential to develop medications that could be commercialized, so we can compel companies to work in this space. And that behavioral pharmacology techniques, I think, provide a really precise understanding of the syndrome that we can use to develop these targets. So I'll end there and just say thank you to my colleagues at the Kahlert Institute. And if you know preclinical basic scientists who are looking for positions, we are hiring. So thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. That was great. All right, so everybody take a minute to think about your questions for Kelly later. Jot them down, and if you're joining us online, do the same, please. We're going to have our Q&A session at the end. And our final speaker for this morning is Sandy Comer. Sandy is a professor of clinical neurobiology in the Department of Psychiatry at Columbia, and a research scientist at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. Her research program focuses on the development of novel approaches to the treatment of OUD and overdose. And this morning, Sandy is going to end our session by focusing on the role of behavioral pharmacology in the development of opioid antagonists for treating patients with OUD. Sandy.
Thanks, Stacey. And thanks, Steve, for inviting me here to give this presentation. I guess I just want to start out by saying how sorry I am that you lost so many colleagues last year. I think yesterday you mentioned that you wanted us to say something about them. The only one that I really knew was Warren Bickel. I had a lot of great scientific conversations with him. He was just amazing to talk to. The way his mind worked was incredible. But I also had a personal connection. His daughter was my son's first girlfriend and love. I think they look so glamorous in this picture. It was pretty, pretty amazing. This is my son's prom. Onto something much more boring. These are the disclosures that I wanted to mention. I've had grant funding and consulting income from Alchemies. Have had NIDA grants to study various formulations of naltrexone. Had a NIDA grant to study a formulation of buprenorphine and levomethadone. And with Sharon, did some studies with Braeburn to study their buprenorphine formulation. So this is the outline of my talk. I thought I'd set the stage a little bit by talking about the current OUD landscape. I think this is not completely new for those of us here. And then this is what Steve suggested I talk about. So I said, okay, that's a good, that's a good outline. So I'm talking about both the challenges and the successes of antagonists as treatments for opioid use disorder. And then I'll summarize and give you some future directions. So the current landscape is that the CDC estimates that over 9 million people have a need for OUD treatment. And of those, just a little more than half actually receive treatment. And of those, the majority are not receiving medications. So only about 25%, or maybe 2.3 million people are receiving medications for treating their disorder. And I mean, we know that psychotherapy is helpful for treating MOUD, but a bunch of different organizations around the world actually have suggested that first-line treatment should be medication. So behavioral health and psychotherapy are important, and I think this is, something that this group here at Vermont is really expert at. But I want to focus on the medication part. So just to set the stage a little bit, we know that the current FDA-approved MOUDs include methadone, buprenorphine, and naltrexone. They're, full, partial, and full and partial agonists and antagonists. And even though they differ in their ability to activate the opioid receptors, they're all effective in reducing the effects of other opioids that are used in combination. So things like heroin and now fentanyl. So these are all effective medications, and I'm really grateful that we have them to treat our patients. I thought I'd kind of walk you through a table, so it might be useful to see how they compare. So what I've got across the top, I thought the conversion Mac to PC would be fine, but the formatting is a little bit off. But anyways, so I have methadone on the left, sublingual bupe, sustained release bupe, oral naltrexone, and sustained release naltrexone across the top. And then in the rows, I have different variables that I think are important in the treatment of OUD. So as I mentioned, all of these, formulations are really effective in treating OUD, except for oral naltrexone, which we'll talk about in a bit. So the transition to MOUD, you heard from Kelly just a little while ago that withdrawal is really a big issue, and that's a theme that's going to emerge in this presentation as well. In terms of transitioning people onto these different medications, methadone is easy. It's a full agonist. Patients like it, they do well. Buprenorphine is a little more complicated because it's a partial agonist and it can precipitate withdrawal. And the antagonist formulations are difficult. So the risk of illicit opioid overdose if a patient relapses is high for the non-injectable formulation. So methadone, buprenorphine, sublingual buprenorphine, or oral naltrexone, if you stop taking the medication, then you can overdose on an opioid pretty easily. They're lower for the sustained release formulations, partly because there's a tail effect that happens as the medication dissipates slowly over time. Medication compliance is good for all of the formulations except for oral naltrexone. Patient convenience is good for all of them except for methadone. Even despite the changes in prescribing of methadone during the COVID era, a lot of states have not adopted these new regulations. So it's kind of hard for patients to get to methadone sometimes. The risk of MOUD misuse, so the misuse of the medication itself, I would characterize with methadone being moderate and buprenorphine, sublingual buprenorphine being low. For the other formulations, there's no risk of misuse or overdose on those medications. I characterize it as low for sublingual bup because overdosing on buprenorphine is really difficult by itself. If it's used in combination with high doses of benzos or alcohol, then, sometimes people have reported overdose on those combinations. Sedation is reported for the agonist and partial agonist medications, and respiratory depression is present for methadone. We know that it accumulates over time, and so people, clinicians have to be careful about the way they titrate the methadone dose up. There is some respiratory depression associated with buprenorphine, but some of the preclinical behavioral pharmacology studies that were done in Jim Woods' lab, for example, showed that even up to the solubility limit of buprenorphine, it's really hard to get an animal to experience a fatal overdose. So with naltrexone, obviously there's no risk of respiratory depression. And shoot, the thing that got cut off on the bottom was price. So not surprisingly, oral naltrexone is really inexpensive. It's like $30 to $60 per month. The methadone and sublingual buprenorphine are kind of in the same ballpark. They're not too expensive. The injectable forms are more expensive, so that's kind of one of the drawbacks of those. But you can see if you look down the columns, there's a lot of green on the sustained release naltrexone column. However, they're not weighted equally, these variables. And so I'll walk you through some of that here. So first I'll talk about the challenges of the antagonist treatment. So historically, and now currently actually, the need for detoxification is the major hurdle associated with antagonist maintenance. Retention and treatment is a problem, and especially with the oral formulation, medication compliance is a big issue. A lot of things changed when the sustained release formulations became available. So changed for the better. So I just wanted to show you some data. These were collected in Turkey in a detox unit, showing that there's high dropout. So about 45% of these patients, they use buprenorphine, sublingual buprenorphine naloxone as a taper to get people through the detox, but still nearly half of them dropped out. There was no significant difference in sociodemographic variables, but the ones with comorbid psychiatric symptoms were more likely to drop out, and severe craving was also a predictor of dropout. So I think that segues nicely with some of the work that Kelly has done. These are data from a study that our group was involved in, where we had patients maintained on morphine given orally 4 times a day, 30 milligrams, same as the regimen that Kelly described. And we also observed high dropout. So this is data that were collected like right when the fentanyl started to infiltrate the illicit opioid supply. So there was no difference in fentanyl positive urines between those who did and did not drop out of treatment. This was a large trial. It was 225 patients. I just wanted to show you this figure. It was from a paper by Adam Basaga in our group. I thought it was a really nice characterization of the different types of detox strategies that have been used over the years. People initially started with methadone tapers, and now there's some studies that I want to describe to you in more detail in a minute, using tapers to transition people over to extended release naltrexone. So this was a study that was published by Adam Basaga in collaboration with Alkermes, where they were trying to develop a regimen of medication combinations that would increase the likelihood of transitioning an opioid-dependent patient onto extended release naltrexone. So this was a large study. It was 378 patients. And they randomized the patients into different groups. So one received a combination of naltrexone and buprenorphine, another received a combination of naltrexone plus placebo, and then there was a placebo group. So the primary endpoint was the proportion of patients who were able to receive the first monthly injection of this extended release naltrexone formulation. And this is the regimen. So across a roughly 1 week inpatient period, patients received starting like low dose of naltrexone twice a day. And then initially they received up to 6 milligrams of sublingual buprenorphine. Across days, the naltrexone dose steadily increased and the buprenorphine dose decreased until it was discontinued on day 4. So that's kind of what we're thinking, is this really tiny doses of naltrexone might help patients transition more easily onto extended release naltrexone. Unfortunately, it did not work. So this is the 3 groups. These are, I'm showing you the COWS scores, so the observer rated withdrawal, and the SOW scores on the bottom. So there's no significant difference in any of the groups on these measures across days. So that was very unfortunate. And there was no difference between in the patients completing the detox. So again, it's pretty low. I mean, it's like only half of the patients completed the detox. So the patients who actually ended up receiving extended release naltrexone was also low. So unfortunately, this was one of the challenges. It belongs in the challenge bucket. So as a follow-up, I worked with Alkermes to run this study. Very similar regimen of naltrexone, starting really tiny, increasing up to 15 milligrams, and then tapering with naltrexone. So in the study that Adam ran, they were anybody who met criteria for opioid use disorder. So they were the heroin and fentanyl users, prescription opioid users, et cetera. This study was designed to see whether or not we could transition patients who were already maintained on buprenorphine over to naltrexone if they were interested in doing that. So they had to be maintained on buprenorphine for at least 3 months, and they needed to be on less than or equal to 8 milligrams for at least 30 days. So this is just another schematic of the design. We had about 3 weeks of screening. We had a bupe lead-in period, and then they were randomized to the 2 dosing conditions. So here we only tested naltrexone in combination with bupe or placebo in combination of bupe. So we dropped the placebo condition. And unfortunately, again, this is part of the challenges part of my talk. The addition of the naltrexone actually worsened COWS scores and SOW scores. This was not a statistically significant difference, but numerically you can see that there's a much higher COWS score. And the participants who received the naltrexone, active naltrexone, also reported increased craving. And this was statistically significantly different. patients patients receiving extended release naltrexone were actually better than the last study that I showed you. So 69 and 76% of patients received the naltrexone in this group of patients who were maintained on buprenorphine. So that was somewhat encouraging. There was no significant difference between the two groups on this endpoint. One thing that I thought was really interesting actually was that we looked at, this was a secondary analysis, but the participants who were maintained on less than 8 milligrams of bup showed a really high transition rate. So 95% of those patients were able to transition compared to 63% who were maintained on the 8 milligram dose. So another variable is retention and treatment and medication compliance. So I just showed you that it's hard to get people onto naltrexone, but what happens if they get there? Like what do we see? So this was a study that was done a long time ago by Ned Nunez in our group, where he took patients who had successfully transitioned onto oral naltrexone and divided them into two groups. One he called the BNT group, it's behavioral naltrexone therapy. So basically he threw all the bells and whistles at this group that he could to try to get them to comply with their medication regimen. So use voucher incentives, motivational therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and a significant other to monitor medication compliance. Everything you can think of. And then the control group was a compliance enhancement group. It was manual guided therapy that was supposed to mimic standard treatment control. But what they found was that even though the BNT group did a bit better, by 6 weeks, only a little more than a quarter of the patients were still in treatment. So that was really kind of not a great number. And then this was a study that came out of Iran, looking at people who were injecting buprenorphine. And what they found was that if they were maintained on methadone, this is a pretty low dose actually of methadone, but their retention and treatment was pretty good. It was very high. Buprenorphine was a little lower. Again, this is a very low dose of buprenorphine. We know that it's not ideal. It's not an optimal dose. 50 milligrams of daily naltrexone. Again, the treatment retention is really low. And I thought it was interesting that, again, only 20% of the people were maintained in treatment after 6 months. So this is very sad data. But I like focusing on the good stuff. So let's talk about the good stuff with naltrexone. I pulled this figure from Frank Volpicelli's and I don't know what his first name is, Dr. Fenton's paper from 2006, describing what we can expect to see with a sustained release formulation of naltrexone compared to oral naltrexone. So as I mentioned earlier, it was a game changer when sustained release naltrexone became available. So with oral naltrexone, you can see that across days, there's this jig-jaggy peaks and troughs of naltrexone plasma levels. At the time, around 1 nanogram per mil was suggested as the optimal plasma level for naltrexone. And, oh, this disappeared. Anyways, you can barely see it. There's the orange, the yellow line here is the sustained release naltrexone plasma level. And you can see that you can't see, I'll tell you. It was maintained above this threshold level across days, which was really great. So again, talking about history, which I thought was really fun that Sharon talked about. At the time, there were 3 companies that were developing sustained release formulations of naltrexone. So it was a race. It was a race among these 3 companies. We went with the biotech company and did a few studies with them with their sustained release naltrexone. And what we found was that the plasma levels of naltrexone were sustained over the course of a month. This is naltrexone and 6-beta naltrexol. So it produced long-lasting plasma levels of naltrexone. I'm not showing you the data, but long-lasting blockade of subjective responses. and it was safe and well tolerated. So we were really happy. So was NIDA. We did a follow-up study, and here's where the behavioral pharmacology comes in as well, where we wanted to look at both the reinforcing and the subjective effects of heroin when they, before and after they were maintained on the sustained release naltrexone. So heroin produced a dose-related increase in progressive ratio breakpoint values and dose-related increases in subjective responses like feeling a good drug effect. When we gave them the sustained release naltrexone, these effects were completely blocked, antagonized. I think in our in our preclinical world, we didn't like using the word block, but the effect dissipated over time. So by week 5, we're starting to see the effects of heroin emerge again. And, you know, by week 6, they're pretty much back to baseline. So this was like really great news. We were like, okay, this is a nice approach. But to get back to the plasma level question, so Felipe Castillo he just finished our T32 program. He's a young physician in our group, and he just submitted his K award. So keeping my fingers crossed that it'll get funded. So he took our data from the heroin challenge trial, and he wanted to know what kind of variability do we see in plasma levels. And what he determined actually was that it's actually not 1 nanogram per mil that's a good threshold dose, it's 2 nanograms per mil. So this is the dose here, I mean, and the threshold plasma level that produces pretty much total suppression of the subjective effects of drug liking for people in this study. Lower than 2 nanograms per mil, there's a lot of variability across participants. Some were actually still able to feel the effects of the heroin. So that was the conclusion from this study, which I thought was really nice. So we ran a small treatment trial with this formulation of naltrexone. We compared the effects of placebo, low dose, and high dose of depot naltrexone. Saw this really nice dose-related increase in plasma levels of naltrexone and 6-beta naltrexol, and also a dose-related increase in treatment retention, which was really encouraging. So it gave us hope. Thought I'd show you this timeline for Vivitrol. It's the Alkermes product. They approved it for alcohol use disorder in 2006. It was approved for AUD in 2010. And the sales have steadily increased, and they're projecting about a $1.3 to $1.6 billion income from Vivitrol in 2028. This is largely due to treatment of alcohol, though, rather than OUD. And I think part of the reason for that is that, as Kelly was describing in her presentation, fentanyl kind of changed things. You know, the withdrawal symptoms were much more severe with fentanyl. I think Kelly and Sharon and I were all calling each other like, are you seeing what we're saying? Oh my gosh. This is a study that Ryan Cook published in 2021, showing that people who were testing positive for fentanyl were half as likely to initiate any MOUD. And the ones who were fentanyl positive were 11 times less likely to initiate with naltrexone because they were already feeling pretty sick. Methadone and buprenorphine are pretty similar in terms of treatment initiation, which was encouraging. So, you know, that was good news. But after in initiation of MOUD, fentanyl use did not impact treatment retention on any of them. So that was encouraging, I think. And then this was a large study that was published by Josh Lee in 2018. I want to draw your attention to these panels because this is per protocol. The ones who were patients who were successfully inducted onto buprenorphine or naltrexone. So this is a comparison of the two groups. And what they reported in this large trial, so it's 570 patients, was that there was a significant difference in terms of successful medication initiation. So it was lower with extended release naltrexone, but still it's fairly high. This is 72% compared to 94% on sublingual bupe. But once people were inducted, there was no difference in all the important endpoints that we care about, relapse, use of opioids, all of those kinds of things. So that was really encouraging. So just to summarize, naltrexone is really effective in antagonizing the effects of opioid agonists. When it first came out, it was considered a magic bullet because it was so selective and it was very safe and well tolerated. Oral naltrexone, I think you might agree, is not really effective in treating OUD. But after patients are successfully transitioned onto sustained release naltrexone, clinical outcomes are really similar to methadone and buprenorphine. So the biggest hurdle, and I'm looking to Kelly to help us solve this, and anybody else in this group who might be interested in doing work in this area, we need to figure out how to effectively detoxify people, especially now with fentanyl in the illicit supply. One little nugget that we got from our study was that maybe people who were maintained on, if they're tapered down on their buprenorphine to less than 8 milligrams, they might be more likely to transition to sustained release naltrexone. Future directions, we really need novel strategies. Just want to give a plug for some of the work that Jermaine Jones in our group has been conducting. So he's interested in this device. It's a transcutaneous auricular neurostimulation device that might be used in combination with other medications for detoxing people. And he's interested in looking at cannabinoids actually as adjuncts to other medications for getting people successfully through detox. So that's all I have. Really want to thank NIDA for funding the large majority of this work, and want to thank my lab. They're really dedicated. It's not easy to do this kind of research, so I want to thank them as well. And thanks for your attention.
That was great. All right, I'm going to invite all three of our presenters up. And so just as a reminder, we'll have our Q&A session now. If you remember, we started off with a great talk by Sharon on kind of historical context and the data supporting the development of bupe for treatment of OUD, and then moved on to Kelly's presentation on really deeper dives into the withdrawal syndrome, and then ending up with Sandy's work on antagonists, especially naltrexone data. So if you think back and I think about your questions, observations, and also Chris is now the point where people who are joining us online could shoot them to you as well. You can let us know. The microphone is in the middle with Jack. Do you want to start us off with your question?
You bet. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yeah.
By disclosure and pride at Pinney Associates, we've helped get most of those new formulations approved, and we take a lot of pride. But it wasn't all easy. And some of you are involved. You saw, oh my God, you're going to do injectable, long acting. Is that going to be safe? I mean, forgetting how dangerous the opioids are. But I have a pitch for everyone in this room that cares about treatment. Every time I get involved in a congressional briefing, which with CPDD, and Sandy is a leader for CPDD on that, part of my pitch is really simple. Buprenorphine is hands down the most important medicine and treatment we have for opioid use disorder. Number one, that's a fact. Number two, we would not have it but for NIDA funding. And if you care about NIH funding, that is one of the most important success stories. It is just hands down. And I urge everybody take every opportunity to make that really clear. I think we have to fight harder than ever for NIH funding. And I'm just going to make comment on each of yours, and I'd love your reactions. On Kelly's, the importance of phenotyping qualitatively and severity is really, really important for all CNS drugs, and opioids are a good model. What we're seeing in the drug pipeline is drugs with lower abuse potential and lower withdrawal. But guess what? FDA still needs studies, because should the label say tapering or not? Whether or not it is scheduled, should it have tapering? What should it have? What can patients expect? And every single CNS drug, Charles Franz mentioned this yesterday, must be assessed for withdrawal. And I think our weakest link is on quantitating on the human side. It's also important, guess what, in which schedule you're going to end up in. And FDA recognizes that withdrawal by itself, in the absence of rewarding effects of the drug, does not mean a drug is going to be scheduled, and most aren't. But if it has, quote, rewarding effects, read their guidance, withdrawal is a factor that can make the difference between which schedule. And buprenorphine, part of what kept it in Schedule 3 was low withdrawal. And during the process of rescheduling, you remember, there were people that said, no, put it in Schedule 2. And then it would not have fit the Data Act of 2000. But that was a battle. So what you're doing in withdrawal is really, really important for a lot of dimensions. And the last thing, aim more at Sandy, is remember Tom McClellan talked about the pyramid of people with addiction. And at the top of the pyramid is the smallest numbers of the heaviest addicted people. And then you've got this giant number of people that still need treatment, but maybe not that level of treatment. And then at the bottom, and he said, don't ignore any of them. But in a lot of clinics, like Brady, the Institutes for Behavioral Resources, where they get a lot of heavy addicted opioid users, methadone is the first choice. So why do we need lots of different treatments? That's still the first choice for a lot of people. And then there's a lot of people that buprenorphine in different forms fits. And the really interesting one now is naltrexone. The possibilities for reaching this broad number of people at the problem level. And the example now that's been commercialized is for alcohol. And it's actually on television. At Penny Associates, we were trying to get companies to do this, and none of them would touch it. But the pitch is, a guy comes on, he says, yeah, I have problem drinking sometime. And I forget what the name of the product is, and I wouldn't say it if I did, but you've probably seen it. And call this number, and you can get naltrexone. And the pitch is you can use it to reduce or quit. And I wonder what you think about, can we reach that level of people instead of just saying, well, you're not using opioids enough. You don't merit treatment. Should we go after them? Okay, I'm going to sit down, but this is just an amazing presentation. I maybe you three can do a paper based on this.
Thanks, Jack.
I guess I'm going to push back on the first thing that you said about buprenorphine being the best. And, because I don't think it serves our field or the patients very well to try to characterize it that way. I know that there have been other people in the field, maybe with initials of MJK, who said that about methadone. They really, methadone was the only one, and buprenorphine and naltrexone were second-class citizens. I compared to other fields, I mean, Kelly gives this really nice presentation about antidepressants, and the large number of antidepressants that are available. They, each one doesn't work equally well for all patients. Having the option for both patients and clinicians is super important. And so I would kind of urge you as you come to advocacy day and stuff like that, just to highlight instead, rather not one is better than the other or not, but to just say, this is great. NIDA funding has allowed us to have all of these medications available, and they work better or worse for some patients, but having the choice is really important.
I agree, but I didn't mean best. It's the most important single category for opioid use disorder in this country, based on use and reach.
Other thoughts,
So-
Sharon?
Yeah, I'm going to comment on that, and then I'm going to come to the base of the pyramid thing. So I agree with Sandy that we want to advocate for all the medications that we have. And as someone who is a recovering cocaine medications development scientist, I really appreciate the fact that we have 3, and we also have some treatments for withdrawal specifically. I'd really love to see a lot more. What we know is, to Jack's point, I think that NIDA really, they drove that train. And I think that does emphasize the importance of continued support for NIH and NIDA. And it is the most widely used, but some of that is structural. And then some of it is the challenges, right, associated with naltrexone. And by structural, I mean for methadone, just because the way that it's.
Without it, that's my point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, but we know that, they don't all work for everybody. They don't all work permanently for even the people that they do work for. And what we really want to do is continue to encourage the science to grow more. So the bottom of the pyramid thing, I've long thought about, like, it would be great if we could put people on naltrexone prophylactically that we think are going to develop opiate use disorder, right? And Nora is talking a lot about pre-addiction, the idea of pre-addiction, right? And so she's put a name to it, and that means that maybe we might be able to get funding to study those types of things. I think it's, finding those people who are willing, that, may recognize that they're using sporadically, but wouldn't have the same challenges of getting onto a naltrexone product. But, that would be really something that's worth exploring for sure.
So I'll just add, thank you for those comments. I wanted to raise the topic that Sandy just alluded to about the depression. So, and one of the talks that I've been giving recently to try to compel people to invest in this space is, and entirely supporting your concept that NIDA is really the primary R&D in the field, is that in 1965, there was a seminal finding in the field of depression and the development of methadone as a treatment for opioid use disorder. And since that point in depression, there's been 90 different versions of medications available, 7 different mechanistic pathways, and enough research to be able to say that we have first, second, and third line treatments. So for the first line, and it's, I think, accepted that if you go in and the first line treatment doesn't work, that's expected. And then there's an expectation that we continue to, adjust the medication, find the one that works for people. In that same period of time, there's been 4 medications. There are now 4 medications available for opioid use disorder, 3 of which are the same mechanistic pathway, right? And so, and then lofexidine being the 4th. So I think that there's huge opportunity to compel industry to invest in this field. But part of it, I think, is the lack of consensus about, in my personal view, the lack of consensus about what constitutes, what the actual treatment target should be. And so that's, I think, the goal of trying to develop an operational definition of what withdrawal is, so that we can convince companies to move into that space.
This is a great question and probe and conversation.
Yeah.
Steve, do you
I have a real practical question, but first I want to congratulate the speakers. I thought each of the presentations was really outstanding. So thanks for doing that. This question reflects my distance from this area of research now, but I was just curious how you measure, now that we're into fentanyl, how do you measure amount of pre-treatment use. So we used to ask people how many bags of heroin you were using,
Convert
and
it.
it actually meant something in terms of what you would need when you treat them. But how has that changed now with fentanyl? And I was thinking about that across, I would say, Sandy and oh my God.
Sharon.
Kelly, Sharon.
Kelly's talking. Kelly, one of our star graduates of our program. Sorry about that, Kelly. That's more me on the second day of the conference, but yeah. So just speak to that a little bit, if you could.
It's very difficult. So I think we've gotten to the point now just asking people the number of times that they administer a day, which is a lot, 7, 8, 9 times a day. I think that maybe a stronger metric would be the duration of time that they've been using because of the lipophilicity of fentanyl and the fact that it seems to be accumulating, that I think probably is more, in my opinion, more related to the experience that they have in treatment.
So I just want to add a comment to the difficulty of this, because I just was reviewing a manuscript from our group that is about to go out for publication, where they collected syringes from local syringe service programs, and they also interviewed the people who were returning the syringes. So we had self-report about what they thought that they were using. And Kentucky is also exclusively fentanyl at this point. It was a little slower to get here than at the East Coast, but it is exclusive. And so it was very interesting because the biggest disconnects between the drug testing of the residue in the syringes and the self-report is that a lot of people were still saying that what they were using was heroin, and no single syringe tested positive for heroin. They all tested positive for fentanyl, and a lot of them tested positive for xylazine, and also some of the other newer additives that we're seeing that are, coming from the veterinary side. So it would be really impossible to quantify it if people don't even know that that's what they're using.
Yeah.
That's what I was going to add, actually, is that, in the past, we often had people who were just using heroin. I mean, more commonly, they're using heroin and cocaine and all kinds of other drugs as well. But with the introduction of fentanyl and more complicated, I'm glad you brought up xylazine, because, the adulterants now are being added into the fentanyl supply because fentanyl is so short acting. I mean, I think Charles has done some really nice data studies where he's characterizing the pattern of fentanyl use in his animals. But we're seeing it as well. I mean, I used to have people report that they're using heroin like 4 to 6 times a day. More recently, they're using 10, 15. I mean, I've had people tell me that they're injecting 50 times a day. It's changing, though, because of xylazine and now medetomidine being added to the illicit supply. So that's stretching it out, or, that's what they call it. It gives the fentanyl legs, they say. So it is really hard to add,
Yeah.
to characterize.
I don't have any recommendations on how we might do it, but it just struck me, I think, because my first study that Maxine assigned me when I first got to BPRU was to just look at the association of pupillary response on the first methadone dose and how many bags of heroin the person said. And it was a very orderly response. So I get a feeling that that's not changed, that how much people are using on the street is related maybe to the phenotypes you're talking about, but how you measure it, I have no idea. How you get morphine equivalents of what they're using.
Is pupil diameter still a predictive or a valuable, or is that off like old?
We've tried to look at the relationship between pupil diameter and withdrawal severity and couldn't find a strong relationship, but could find a strong relationship between pupil and agonist activity or agonist reports.
Yeah.
One of the other things I think is complex, and that I know I've talked to both of you, and I've talked to other people that are doing this kind of work. It used to be that when you did the residential studies, you would bring people in and you would stabilize them, and you generally would stabilize them all in the same dose, which gave you some idea that you had some pharmacological control over things, and that made them the same, which I know is not actually true either. Even if they are maintained on the same doses, we see that the response is different among individuals. But now where people are moving to is kind of titrating, and there's individual differences, and so you're trying to do one study but you can't get people to settle in at the same maintenance dose. And so I think that variability also goes to a lot of what we don't know yet about particularly what the additives are doing in the long term to the expression of dependence,
And
physical
then-
dependence.
And just to throw this out there in case people are interested in studying it. So I've been talking over the last few weeks with a young clinician from UPenn, Ashish Thakrar. You've probably talked to him as well, you guys. But what he's observing in the Philly area is that people have shifted away from xylazine. And in terms of, sorry, not people have shifted away, the dealers have shifted away from adding xylazine to the illicit supply to medetomidine. And xylazine was like sensationalist news where they have lots of wounds and just really terrible things. But it was surprising that the withdrawal syndrome that was observed in somebody who had been using a combination of fentanyl and xylazine was not as bad as everybody was expecting, because they were thinking that there would be this adrenergic rebound and all this kind of stuff when that didn't actually happen. But now with medetomidine, for some reason, you're not seeing the wound. They're not seeing the wounds as much anymore. But the withdrawal from medetomidine is just really bad, and they're using clonidine and lofexidine to try to alleviate the withdrawal symptoms that are observed from discontinuing medetomidine. Doesn't do anything. They have to admit them to the ICU in order to get IV dexmedetomidine. That's the only thing that's helping. And, Ashish, I just talked to him a few days ago, and he said that they're admitting like 1 to 2 patients a day to the ICU because of this. So that's like,
Sandy, what is medetomidine?
it's another alpha-2 adrenergic
Ah.
agonist.
Is it originally for veterinary use as well, like xylazine, or is it a different?
Well, the
indication?
dexmedetomidine, which is the medication that we've been working with, and it is approved, and it's the isomer of medetomidine. Medetomidine is racemate. So dexmedetomidine has been used in the in the surgical setting for sedation.
Okay.
They've given it to babies. But yeah, medetomidine is just a different pharmacological profile at the alpha-2 adrenergic subtypes. And it has a different withdrawal.
It's longer acting as well, right? Yeah.
Also found in our syringes
Yeah,
just recently.
yeah. Ugh, it's terrible. Anyways.
So I have some questions that are pretty naive, even though I've worked alongside Sandy for 1,000 years. So Kelly, again, this is coming from a naive perspective, and I really appreciate dissecting withdrawal as a person who studies cannabis withdrawal. But it seems like my impression is there has to be this deep emotional discomfort during withdrawal. And I'm wondering, and I know your factor 1, I think, was along those lines, but it can't be lacrimation and chills that are driving the, relapse. It's got to be it. And I'm just curious, are we able to capture that? Anxiety is, I think, your largest symptom, and that certainly characterizes cannabis withdrawal as well. But again, this is just my layperson's perception of opioid withdrawal, not having worked with that population. It's got to be something deeper than some of these physical symptoms. And I know you're getting at that, but do you think we're capturing that deep discomfort?
I agree, and I don't think we are.
Yeah.
We're actually developing at the moment, we're trying to test out a withdrawal catastrophizing scale, trying to,
Yeah.
because we know that pain catastrophizing is highly predictive of response to pain treatments. And so we're trying to tap into that kind of like because it is a very deep-seated fear.
Yeah.
And it also is something I think that's engendered because people are actively trying to avoid it now, up to 10 times a day for years before they come into treatment. And it's just taken on such an experience in addition to whatever, actual physiological or psychological event it's actually invoking. But no, I agree. I think that it's something that's much deeper than anxiety.
It's like a sensitization, like over time, chronic pain, people get more and
Yeah.
more sensitive to the onset. Is that like the more you've experienced years of withdrawal, acute withdrawal, like, because when we would interact with the patients here, it seemed like that was driving it. Is
A
that
very
kind of what the-
deep-seated fear, yeah. The other thing that I've wondered a lot about is we've done analysis of the symptoms that people experience with fentanyl during fentanyl exposure versus prior heroin exposure. Anxiety is now the #1 symptom, and I wonder how much of that is also kind of secondary because we see changes in heart rate and this kind of like acute physiological effect. And so I feel like they're all kind of like intertwined as well. But no, anxiety is up front as one of the leading symptoms. And I think it's probably an imprecise
Deeper
characterization.
than that, yeah.
Mm.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because I think one thing that maybe you haven't, well, maybe you are doing this, is measuring impulsivity, because that was one of the things we noticed early on when people first started using fentanyl and they came to the inpatient unit. They just like suddenly are like, I gotta go.
I gotta go.
And it's like giving up. Well, morphine didn't actually work all that well for any of us, I don't think. But giving up a lot of payment, a lot of contact with clinical personnel and all that kind of stuff, but it just felt like it was very impulsive, this decision making. And I don't,
That gets the
there-
delay discounting a little
yeah,
bit, maybe.
yeah. That's why I was asking those questions. I think one
Yeah.
of the speakers yesterday talked about that. And I'm like, I wonder if there's a way to adapt your kind of procedures to, I know it's not prevention, but it's, it's a way of maybe, addressing the issue of impulsivity and things like that.
Right. And then for Sharon, I did not know that you can't block buprenorphine's effects with naloxone. Did you say that, or?
I said it in the context of Don's work. So
I'm just curious about that.
it's
Why
just, I mean, it's an affinity issue.
it is.
Yeah,
Okay. So
yeah.
bupe is just sticking on there.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
So I'm looking, we have a few more minutes, but only about like 3 or 4 more minutes. So maybe Martha.
A short question. Thank you all
Sure.
so much. Wonderful presentations. I just wanted to follow up on the comment about lipophilic nature of fentanyl. And I'm wondering, when you were looking at the withdrawal and phenotypes, were you also accounting for like BMI, for want of a better measure of adiposity? I'm just wondering if that's protective in any way for severe withdrawal, because you've got that sequestration of fentanyl in the adipose tissue.
Funny you should ask. Rachel Luba in our group was interested in that question. So she reanalyzed the data from our large study that we were involved with on this medication. So anyways, she looked at the dropout rates from people who had used fentanyl versus those who had not. And the BMI was predictive of, was protective actually against severe withdrawal. So it was really a nice kind of characterization. I think it followed on the heels of some of the work that was done at Hopkins, actually, showing that the withdrawal, what was it? It was something that
Andrew study,
Yeah.
the individuals that were admitted to a residential treatment program and had known abstinence from fentanyl were testing positive for it for up to 2 weeks after.
yeah.
Okay.
I'm just wondering if we should be counseling patients about that when we're considering what drug to start them on, or
Yeah.
Considering
what their
taking it.
experiences may be. Anyway,
Yeah.
thank you both.
So can I just add a comment related to that? One way that I've been thinking and talking about fentanyl is that I think it has features that are very similar to cannabis, and the kind of like the peripheral sequestration and kind of extended, the protracted clearance, but it's a very short acting subjective experience. So it's like functionally a long acting opioid with a short profile of effects. And then I think in that way, it's the same, that helps us kind of inform how we would do naltrexone or buprenorphine inductions and things.
Thank you.
Thanks, Martha. Maxine?
I did want to thank Sharon for reminding us about the rocky road that it takes for long and rocky road, and the passionate advocates who are played a part in that, some of whom, I knew as well. But I had a quick question for Sandy. Is there any data on the types of people who elect to go on the sustained release naltrexone, the types of addicts? Are they different from the ones who go to methadone and buprenorphine? I'm just wondering.
Yeah, we didn't observe any differences. I don't know if anybody systematically looked at that. I actually, when the biotech clinical trial started, I was really nervous that people would just be like, no way, and we would have a really hard time recruiting. It was so easy. It was one of the easiest studies that I had to recruit.
Stable lifestyle for some people.
Yeah, and no, they weren't. They were just sort of, everybody was interested. They kind of really liked the concept of getting a single injection that lasted for a month and they didn't have to think about it. I mean, maybe it's different now with the fentanyl, severe withdrawal that they might experience, but at least when we did the study, in the early 2000s, we had no trouble recruiting people onto naltrexone.
All right, we are actually out of time. Sorry, Jack. Maybe you can come up and talk to our presenters at the end, because we're going to turn this room around. I think we have 10 minutes for a break and then back in here, right, Steve, for the cannabis session. I want to thank our presenters, though, for the great talks.